during that week, God really shone a spotlight on my life and in all of my deepest questions. And I had an image of us all being in bottles. And like we could reach up through the bottle and we could touch each other's fingers, but no one was strong enough to pull the other one out of the bottle. So eventually we would tire and go back into our own loneliness. By the time Friday came, when Nanette was going back for a lecture, I was really distraught and just sitting on the floor of my little kitchen, kind of rocking and slightly banging my head on the refrigerator door until I said to myself, people that sit in the dark and bang their head on the refrigerator door are nuts, so I'm going to get up and get out of here. And I remembered that Nanette was going to this lecture, so I called her up. I had a motorcycle in those days, a very nice white Honda 50cc motorcycle. And she didn't have a car. She was living with her mom. So I drove her to the lecture. And at that time, the unification movement was called the Unified Family. And the main building was in Washington, right off of 16th Street on Upshur Street. Anyway, I listened to Chapter 1, an introduction and Chapter 1, in a room I thought was full of other guests, so I felt very invisible in the back. It was actually full of members, because Rebecca Salonen was going to teach that night, and she was an excellent teacher, so everyone had come to hear her. And then Rebecca came up and began to teach. And as I sat in the back and I listened, a couple of things really struck me. One, she talked about how the most important longing of our heart is to experience joy. And that's because that was God's deepest desire. And I thought back on the most important experience in my life, and that had that feeling in it. So that struck very deeply in me when she said that. And second, at that time, at the end of the first chapter, the principle of creation, or how God created the universe, and what are the laws that govern the universe, we taught the heart of God. And that was a section on how, because man had deviated from these laws, God was suffering, man was suffering, the universe was suffering. And I had never heard God spoken of like that. And that also touched me very profoundly. We went through the end of the evening. In my cynicalness, at one point I looked at Becky and I thought, yeah, you talk a good love, but what if I just went right up to you, really close, and said, hi? Anyway, the thought passed and I went on listening to the lecture. Becky went through the crowd, and came right up to me and came really close and said, hi. So as we went home that night, I was driving my motorcycle, and in those days you didn't have to wear helmets, so I had really long hair. It was black then. And Nanette was hanging on for dear life behind me. And I started crying. And she could feel, my tummy was wiggling. She said, what's the matter? I said, he loves me. And being an all-American girl, she said, who loves you? And I said, God loves me. These tears are driving in the rain. And she said, I've been trying to tell you that for years. And they said, I know, but it's really true, and that's really different. So we continued to study the principle, and I continued to test the reality of God, the relationship with God and the reality. And that was the most important thing for me. So I found that being raised as a Nazarene and then being trained, in Western art and philosophy that at college, I finally found a teaching that I could actually hang both of them on. One didn't negate the other. They all worked together. And Nanette moved into the center much later, but I moved in after a couple of months because I just found that I had this conversation going with God. And one day I just said, but this would be nice for a center. It's near GW University. Wouldn't you like, can't I just stay here and go visit? And I felt like God said to me, you can stay here if you want to, but I have to be at the center. I became a member, and there were a lot of traditions in those days too. At the first of every month, we would do an all-night prayer. We would take turns, and part of our tradition, if we had a disagreement or problem, was to pray about it. Prayer was a very important part of the community. And the idea of reestablishing yourself as a pure sister or pure brother was a really unusual opportunity. And we squabbled the way brothers and sisters do. But Miss Young-Moon Kim, who was the pioneer who had started the center there, was we were very fortunate to hear the principle through her. After that first night, next time I came, Becky taught chapter 2, The Fall of Man. And again, because all of this was still quite new to me, my response was sort of like, well, if there are angels, then, and isn't this just going to make a confused area even more confusing? And, it went on like that. So she decided I should stay and hear the mission of Jesus, which was very wise. And I did stay, and I was deeply moved by Father's understanding of the mission of Jesus. Because I just think I had always known that Jesus had had a really, really, really painful life. Then we went through the rest, and also resurrection and succession of missions as opposed to reincarnation, because Nanette had been doing automatic handwriting, and we'd been kind of getting into, well, what is the possibility of reincarnation? So very clearly, I felt it was a very clear answer to how succession of missions just made a lot more sense to me. So I heard the conclusion, which was that Christ was on earth, and the blessing of marriage of the Lamb had come. And this man who was listening to it with me got up and walked out in a huff to have a cigarette on the porch, saying, "Oh, well, I thought you were going to tell me that Christ was on earth," and then he was gone. And I looked at Becky and I said, "I thought that's what you said." And she said, "I thought that's what I said." She said, "Some people just hear it and some don't hear it." And then my real question, I just looked at her and said, "Does this mean that good is going to win?" And she thought about it a minute, and then she said, "Yes." And I said, "Okay, then I'm in." But before I could really work completely in the movement, I still had to settle this question about God. Could God be, could I count on God? Or would He just leave? And after about 2 years, I was up in the women's dormitory room, and I just cleaned it. It was sunshiny day, spring birds singing, and I just, looked up at the sky, at the ceiling, and said, Are you really real? And I felt like I'd just taken a knife and stuck it in somebody's heart. Just like everything around me just went, and then after a moment, I felt like He said this line from Dover Beach. He said, "Ah, love, let us be true to one another." And after that day, I never asked that question again. I knew the answer.